The sun hung low over the imperial capital, casting a sickly red glow on the execution scaffold. The air was thick with the tension of the crowd, who had gathered not just to witness the end of a traitor's life, but to bear witness to the fall of yet another insignificant human. Their eyes were cold, devoid of sympathy. It was just another execution, just another rebel crushed under the heel of the Galactic Empire. Except they were wrong. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with. Elia Corys stood at the center of the scaffold, her neck draped by the noose, her hands bound tightly behind her back. A single tear traced its way down her cheek, though not from fear. There was defiance in her eyes, an unspoken promise that this was not the end. This would not be how her story ended. Her heart raced, not from terror, but from anticipation. She knew who would come for her, knew that the Empire would learn a lesson too harsh to forget. The Empire had underestimated her. She was just a bride, a simple human woman who had never asked for the attention of the stars. But the moment they captured her, they had made the greatest mistake of their endless, cold reign. For Elia Corys was married to a legend, Baba Yaga, the name whispered across the galaxy with reverence and fear. A name synonymous with destruction, with vengeance, with impossible odds. It was a name known even in the deepest corners of the Empire. The Imperials thought they were dealing with an innocent woman, unaware of the storm that followed her, an unstoppable force. Baba Yaga wasn't just a man, he was a nightmare brought to life. And every cell in Elia's body screamed with the knowledge that he was out there, moving toward her. The Imperial soldiers around the scaffold stood rigid, their eyes trained on her, their faces masked with indifference. They couldn't see it, the tremor in the air, the way the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Elia wasn't just a pawn in their cruel game. She was the bait. The noose tightened slightly around her neck, the harshness of the rope pressing against her skin. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the silence of the crowd almost unbearable. Her vision blurred as the executioner lifted the lever. And yet, she wasn't afraid. Not because she didn't fear death. Elia had already embraced it long ago. It was because she knew what was coming next. The Empire had been foolish, thinking they could end her life with a mere pull of a lever. They had no idea who her husband was, and they would soon understand the magnitude of their error. A sound, faint at first, reached her ears. It was like the rumble of thunder, distant and foreboding, but with an intensity that made the ground beneath her feet quiver. The soldiers turned their heads, looking toward the horizon where the first signs of an approaching storm were visible. But it wasn't weather that threatened the Empire. It was the man, the monster, who followed her everywhere. Baba Yaga had arrived. The rumble grew louder, shaking the ground beneath them. The soldiers' eyes widened, fear creeping into their hearts as the sky darkened. A massive shadow began to stretch across the skyline, growing larger with every passing second. The air grew colder, charged with a deadly energy. The Empire's fortress trembled, as if the very walls knew their end was near. Elia's lips curled into a small smile, the kind of smile that would send shivers down the spine of anyone who truly understood. Her husband was coming, and this time, the Empire would regret ever crossing him. The scaffold shook, the ground beneath her feet trembling, as if it too could sense the presence of death drawing near. The crowd shifted, whispers running through the gathered masses. Was it an earthquake? A military assault? They couldn't fathom the truth. They couldn't know the depth of the nightmare they had just unleashed. But Elia knew. The executioner hesitated. He looked up at the sky, his face pale as Baba Yaga's shadow consumed the city, blotting out the sun. The soldiers turned toward the horizon, their training and discipline evaporating under the weight of something far more terrifying than they had been prepared for. And that was when Elia realized something. They weren't just about to learn who Baba Yaga was, they were about to become living proof of why that name was feared. The lever was pulled. But Elia Corys wasn't there to die. She was there to bear witness to the beginning of the Empire's final fall. The ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't some natural disaster. It was something far worse. The tremors reverberated through the imperial capital, sending ripples of panic across the ranks of soldiers and officials stationed at every corner of the city. The sky darkened unnaturally, as if the heavens themselves had turned their gaze toward the oncoming storm. And that storm was a figure, a legend, his name etched into the nightmares of every soldier in the galaxy. Baba Yaga had arrived. From the moment the first tremor hit, the soldiers knew. They didn't need orders. They didn't need a briefing. They knew exactly who was coming, and they knew that nothing, not their best troops, not their advanced weaponry, could stop him. The imperial capital had become a battlefield, but it wasn't one that the Empire would control for long. Ilya Koris, still standing on the scaffold with the noose around her neck, could feel it, the surge of energy, the overwhelming presence in the air. Baba Yaga was near. The Empire had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. She didn't smile or show fear. She simply closed her eyes, as if to absorb the essence of the moment, the calm before the storm that would break their empire to pieces. Above, the sky was no longer the pale blue of an ordinary day. It had turned an ominous shade of gray, swirling with dark clouds, as if something ancient and malevolent was descending upon the city. The distant rumble of Baba Yaga's approach reverberated, growing louder with every passing second. It was as if the very earth itself knew that death had come to collect. The soldiers began to panic. A few tried to remain composed, ordering reinforcements to assemble, to hold the line. But no one could fight against the shadow that had begun to creep across the city. The capital's defenses, those same walls and weapons designed to keep invaders at bay, had no chance against the legendary figure advancing toward them. Every soldier within a 10-mile radius felt it, an oppressive weight, a pressure that was almost suffocating. Baba Yaga was not merely a man. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable tidal wave of death, and the Empire had no defense against him. Ilya, despite being bound and on the verge of death herself, felt an eerie calmness wash over her. This was what she had known would happen. This was what she had been waiting for. The inevitable moment when her husband would sweep in and reduce the Empire's iron grip to dust. She wasn't the weak, helpless bride they thought her to be. No, she was the anchor that had drawn the beast to the heart of the Empire. And now they would pay. The first line of Imperial guards stationed at the city's edge were the first to feel the wrath of Baba Yaga. He didn't need to draw a sword to inflict fear. His very presence shattered their resolve. A handful of the bravest soldiers charged toward him, their weapons raised, prepared to face whatever nightmare awaited them. But Baba Yaga didn't even acknowledge them. One moment, the soldiers were there, running toward him with their guns aimed and their hearts pounding. The next, they were scattered across the ground, their bodies twisted and broken. Baba Yaga had moved faster than any could track, striking with such lethal precision that even the Empire's best trained couldn't keep up. His presence alone was enough to shatter the line of defense. It was over before it had even begun. Ilya heard the screams from the distance. The soldiers, once proud and confident in their power, now fled in terror. The Empire's military might was nothing before the force that was descending upon them. It wasn't just the soldiers they feared, it was Baba Yaga himself, the man who had become a living legend, a myth turned flesh. She didn't need to watch the carnage. She already knew what it would look like. Baba Yaga was never subtle. He didn't need to be. He was a storm of destruction, his movements so fast, so brutal, that none could escape. The imperial capital had become his personal hunting ground. In the chaos, the imperial officers at the highest levels scrambled to respond. They had no contingency plan for a man like Baba Yaga, no strategy to deal with a force that had no equal. They could call for reinforcements, activate planetary shields, launch orbital strikes. But none of that would matter. Not now. Not with Baba Yaga's fury unleashed. Baba Yaga didn't care for their plans. He didn't care for their technology. He cared for one thing, Ilya. And he had come for her. His relentless drive pushed him through every obstacle, tearing through every line of defense, as though they were paper. He wasn't just coming to save his wife. He was coming to teach the Empire a lesson they would never forget. And when he arrived at the heart of the capital, The remaining soldiers dared not stand in his way. His boots struck the ground with a sound like thunder, sending vibrations through the walls of the Imperial stronghold. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural fire, scanned the city before fixing on the scaffold where Ilya stood, the noose still hanging loosely around her neck. The Imperial commander stood at the forefront, trying to muster the courage to give an order. But his voice faltered as Baba Yaga's gaze fell upon him. No words were exchanged. There was no need. Baba Yaga's eyes alone spoke volumes, a promise that no one would leave this day alive unless they were on his terms. Ilya didn't flinch when Baba Yaga's figure emerged from the smoke and dust, standing tall like an avenging god. She knew exactly what was coming next. The Empire had made its final mistake. The truth had always been hidden in plain sight. Ilya Kores stared at the holographic screen in front of her, the light from it casting a sickly glow on her face. The records she had just uncovered were more than just a set of data. They were the Empire's dark heart laid bare. The very thing that had motivated the Galactic Empire's endless pursuit of control, the catalyst for their atrocities, had been tied to something she never expected: her husband's past. Baba Yaga's legacy was far more complex than even he had let on. The documents flickered before her, each one more shocking than the last. They weren't just after her, they were after him. Baba Yaga, the myth, the legend, had always been a figure of fear. But the Empire's true interest wasn't his brutality or his strategic genius. No, it was something far older, more dangerous. Something that had been hidden for centuries, locked away in the most secretive vaults of the Empire's archives. And it was tied to an artifact, an ancient power that had once belonged to the lost civilizations of the galaxy. Ilya's hands trembled as she scrolled through the data. The Empire knew of the artifact's existence, but had never been able to locate it. That was until now. Her marriage to Baba Yaga had not been by chance. The artifact was connected to his bloodline, a lineage so ancient it predated even the Empire itself. And the Empire, blinded by its lust for power, had been hunting it without ever realizing that Baba Yaga was the key to unlocking its potential. The walls of the secret chamber seemed to close in around her as she pieced the truth together. The Empire's destruction of countless civilizations, its relentless pursuit of conquest. It wasn't just for dominance. It was for control over something far darker. The artifact, she realized, held a power that could turn the tide of war, not just between planets, but between entire galaxies. Ilya let out a sharp breath, her mind racing. If the Empire succeeded in harnessing the artifact's power, there would be no stopping them. They would become unstoppable, a force that could wipe out any resistance, subjugate any race. And Baba Yaga? He wasn't just a tool in this equation. He was the Empire's greatest threat. Not only could they not control the artifact, but they also couldn't eliminate him. The truth was more chilling than she had imagined. The Empire's scientists had been working in secret to unlock the artifact's powers, studying ancient texts and forbidden technology to harness its energy. They had already made progress, and their experiments were nearing a breakthrough. But it was all futile if they didn't have the right person. That person was Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga had no idea what the Empire had discovered about him, about his bloodline, but Ilya now understood the true weight of what he carried, what he had inherited. His very existence was a threat to the Empire's carefully laid plans. And if they knew the full truth, there would be no peace for him, no place to hide, no safe haven. But the most shocking revelation was buried at the end of the records. The artifact didn't just possess immense power, it was a key to something far greater than the Empire had even begun to understand. The secrets it unlocked could reshape the fabric of reality itself. Ilya's heart pounded as she absorbed the enormity of the situation. The stakes had just escalated to an unimaginable level. The battle for the galaxy wasn't just about fighting the Empire anymore. It was about stopping them from getting their hands on something that could destroy everything. She had to warn Baba Yaga. She had to make him understand what they were up against. But there was no time. The Empire would stop at nothing to seize the artifact, and they would use her to do it. The ground outside trembled again, a low rumble signaling the presence of their forces. They were already closing in, determined to crush the rebellion. But this time, it wouldn't be enough. Ilya had seen the plans, had learned the terrible truth. And she wasn't going to let it happen. She rushed out of the chamber, her mind set on one thing: finding Baba Yaga before the Empire could use her to bait him into their trap. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about stopping a power that could unravel everything. Ilya was ready. But the real fight was only just beginning. The air was thick with death. Baba Yaga stood at the heart of the imperial capital, his boots crushing the debris of what had once been a bustling city. The Empire's soldiers lay scattered in every direction, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their blood staining the cracked pavement. He hadn't even broken a sweat. His blade had sung its song, its edge slicing through armor and flesh with cold precision. But now, the Empire was retaliating, and this time they weren't sending mere soldiers. They were sending their best. Baba Yaga had expected this. He had always known that the Empire wouldn't take his wrath lying down. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The sound of engines roared overhead as Imperial gunships swooped low, their guns blazing, their pilots determined to put an end to him. But Baba Yaga wasn't just some rogue insurgent. He was a force of nature, and nature could not be controlled. Ilya stood beside him, her eyes scanning the sky, her hand tightening around the weapon she had been forced to take up. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The Empire was powerful, yes, but it didn't know what it was dealing with. It didn't know that Baba Yaga was more than just a man with a sword. He was a living weapon, forged from the same chaos the Empire had tried to suppress. "Stay close," Baba Yaga muttered, his voice a low growl. Ilya nodded, her mind racing. She had already seen what he could do, but now she wasn't sure if even he could withstand what was coming. The Empire had learned quickly. They had learned that their usual tactics wouldn't work. This time, they had brought something far more dangerous. The first wave of assault came in the form of armored vehicles, massive, tank-like machines designed to crush resistance. They rumbled toward them, their weapons locked and ready. Baba Yaga didn't flinch. He had already seen this kind of attack before, and it would be no different from the others. With a single fluid motion, he pulled a grenade from his belt and threw it with deadly accuracy. The explosion that followed was deafening, and the armored vehicle was torn to shreds in an instant. But this wasn't enough. The Empire had more in store. A new wave of soldiers, no longer the standard foot soldiers, but something far more terrifying, emerged from the shadows. They were genetically enhanced, their bodies augmented with cybernetics, their eyes glowing with a cold, mechanical fire. The enhanced soldiers, bred for one purpose, to eliminate threats like Baba Yaga, charged forward with unnerving precision. Ilya's breath caught in her throat as they approached. These were no ordinary soldiers. These were the Empire's ultimate weapons, created in secret to eliminate the most dangerous targets. She had seen the file. She knew what they could do. They were faster, stronger, and more ruthless than anything the Empire had ever deployed before. Baba Yaga didn't hesitate. He met them head-on, his sword ablur as it cut through the air with deadly force. The enhanced soldiers fought back with everything they had, their movements swift and coordinated. But they were no match for Baba Yaga's experience and raw power. One by one, they fell, their cybernetic limbs severed in clean strokes. The air was filled with the sound of metal on metal, the clash of weapons, and the screams of the dying. Ilya, despite her fear, moved quickly, her training taking over as she fired at the remaining soldiers from behind cover. She wasn't a fighter like Baba Yaga, but she had learned enough to defend herself. Every shot she took landed with precision, but she knew it wasn't enough. There were too many of them. They were closing in, tightening the noose around them. "Baba Yaga," she called out, her voice rising above the chaos. "We need to move." He glanced at her, his face a mask of grim determination. "We'll fight until the last." And fight they did. For hours, the battle raged. Baba Yaga cut through the enhanced soldiers like a tempest, leaving nothing but death in his wake. Ilya, though terrified, stood by his side, her hands trembling as she fired round after round. She wasn't sure how much longer they could last, but she knew they had no choice but to keep fighting. The Empire was relentless, but so was Baba Yaga. The ground beneath them trembled once more as another wave of reinforcements arrived. This time, it wasn't just soldiers or tanks. It was their final weapon, an enormous warship cloaked in the Empire's insignia, hovering ominously above them. Ilya's heart sank. They couldn't fight that. They couldn't possibly. But Baba Yaga was already moving. He was already thinking ahead, already calculating the odds. Without hesitation, he grabbed Ilya's arm and pulled her toward a nearby building, his eyes locking onto the warship above. "We end this now," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. Ilya looked at him, fear and admiration warring within her. She didn't know how they would defeat the warship, but she knew one thing for sure. With Baba Yaga by her side, they might just have a chance. And as the warship descended toward them, she gripped her weapon tighter, knowing that the final confrontation was just beginning. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Ilya Kori stood in the rubble, her breath ragged, as she stared into the eyes of the one person she never expected to see again, her sister, now an unrecognizable monster. Once they had shared everything, laughter, secrets, dreams. But that was before the Empire had gotten its hands on her, before they had twisted her into something else, something cold, something deadly. Her sister's eyes were no longer human. They glowed with a mechanical intensity, void of any warmth, any trace of the woman Ilya had known. The Empire had turned her into one of their ultimate weapons, genetically enhanced, augmented with cybernetics, and programmed to obey without question. She was no longer the sister Ilya had once loved. She was an agent of destruction, a force unleashed to end lives. "Ilya," the woman said, her voice cold and detached, like a machine speaking in human tones. "I have no need for your weakness." It was as though a blade had stabbed through Ilya's chest. The sister she once knew was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating soldier who saw her only as an obstacle, something to eliminate. Ilya's mind raced, heart hammering in her chest. She had never wanted this. She had never imagined this moment would come, facing her sister on the opposite side of the battlefield, with everything they once had now shattered. "You don't have to do this," Ilya whispered, her voice trembling despite her best effort to remain strong. "Please, I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me." The augmented soldier before her didn't respond. Her head tilted slightly, as though processing Ilya's words. The faintest flicker of recognition passed through her glowing eyes, but it quickly vanished, replaced by an unfeeling, cold stare. There was no trace of the love they had once shared, only a machine programmed to destroy. Ilya tightened her grip on the weapon in her hand, her fingers numb from the tension. She didn't want to fight her sister. She didn't want to raise her weapon, but she had no choice. If she hesitated for even a second, her sister would kill her without a second thought. The enhanced soldier moved faster than Ilya could react, lunging toward her with blinding speed. Ilya barely managed to sidestep, the soldier's arm grazing her side. The pain flared briefly, but it didn't matter. She had to stay focused. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "You were weak before," the soldier said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Now you are nothing." Ilya's heart sank as the words echoed in her mind. Was this what the Empire had done to her sister? Had they truly erased everything she had been? Or was her sister now so far gone that there was no hope of bringing her back? The two women circled each other, the tension thick in the air. Every move Ilya made felt like a betrayal, but she couldn't afford to think of that now. Her sister, this machine, wasn't the person she had once known. And Ilya had to survive. For Baba Yaga. For the future. With a sudden, violent move, her sister lunged again. This time, Ilya wasn't fast enough. The enhanced soldier's cybernetic arm grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. Ilya cried out, but her voice was lost in the deafening sound of the battle raging around them. Her sister's eyes glowed brighter, and Ilya realized she had moments left, moments to make a choice. The weapon in her other hand, the one she had been trained to use in moments like this, pulsed with energy. She hesitated for a split second, but that was all it took. Her sister didn't hesitate. With a swift, practiced motion, she pulled Ilya closer, her other arm raised, ready to strike. "No," Ilya shouted, using every ounce of strength to twist free. The gun in her hand fired, its blast striking her sister square in the chest. The enhanced soldier staggered back, her chest smoking from the impact. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Ilya's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for any sign of life from her sister. The moment dragged on. Then her sister spoke again. "I don't feel," the soldier whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I was weak." The hesitation that followed was enough for Ilya to close the gap, her gun now aimed at her sister's head. The woman, her sister, stood there, blinking, as though trying to regain some fragment of her humanity. It was a flicker of hope, but it wasn't enough. Before Ilya could react, her sister's eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward again, but this time, she hesitated. Her movement slowed, as though fighting some internal battle. The momentary weakness gave Ilya the chance she needed. With a final, heart-wrenching cry, Ilya pushed her sister away. The force sent the augmented soldier crashing to the ground. Ilya stood over her, weapon raised, her heart breaking with every beat. She didn't want to kill her, but she knew it was the only way to stop the Empire's reign of terror. With trembling hands, Ilya made her choice. The sky burned. The Empire had never known defeat, not like this. The capital, once a symbol of their might, now lay in ruins, its towering structures reduced to smoldering debris. The last remnants of the Imperial forces, broken and leaderless, scattered in the wake of Baba Yaga's wrath. Yet, as the fires raged, a new kind of storm was brewing, one that would decide the fate of the galaxy. Baba Yaga stood amid the destruction, his sword dripping with the blood of the Empire's soldiers. He had torn through their defenses with the fury of a storm, unstoppable and relentless. The battle had been brutal, and the cost of victory had been high. Yet, as he looked out across the ruins, a dark satisfaction filled him. The Empire was done. Its reign had ended at the hands of a single man and his wife. Ilya Koris, standing at his side, surveyed the devastation, her heart heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. Her sister, her family, had been torn apart by this war. Yet, as she looked at Baba Yaga, she knew that the destruction of the Empire was the only way forward. Their fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about freedom, for them, for humanity, and for every other species oppressed under the Empire's iron fist. "Is it over?" Ilya asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "For them," Baba Yaga replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But not for us." The Empire's leaders had all been slaughtered in the final assault, executed without mercy. The soldiers had fallen before them like leaves in a storm, their attempts to regroup met with violent resistance. Now, as the last vestiges of the Imperial forces retreated into the shadows, only one question remained. What came next? Ilya glanced at the horizon, the orange and red hues of the setting sun casting a haunting glow over the battlefield. The aftermath was a desolate landscape, scorched earth, shattered buildings, and the unmistakable scent of death hanging in the air. But amidst the ruin, there was a glimmer of hope. The galaxy had been freed from the Empire's chokehold, but that freedom came at a great cost. The final confrontation had been inevitable, but it had taken everything they had. The fight against the Empire was no longer just about survival. It was about the future. The power they had fought to destroy was now gone. But what would take its place? Baba Yaga knew that their work was far from over. He had destroyed the Empire, but the galaxy was a fractured place, teetering on the edge of chaos. There were others, factions and warlords, who would rise in the void left behind by the Empire's collapse. The real struggle was just beginning. And in the back of his mind, he knew that even as one empire fell, another might soon rise. This time it might be theirs. "We have to rebuild," Ilya said, her voice steady despite the weariness that gripped her. "The galaxy needs something new, something better." Baba Yaga turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He had fought for freedom, for vengeance, but he had never thought about what came after. He had been a weapon for so long, driven by rage and revenge. But now, the battle was over. The war had ended, and the pieces were scattered at his feet. The galaxy was in his hands, and hers. "Rebuilding starts with us," Baba Yaga said, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "But it won't be easy. There are too many who will want to seize power, to fill the vacuum we've created. We can't afford to let the same mistakes happen again." Ilya nodded. She knew the challenge ahead. Rebuilding would take time, patience, and leadership. They had to unite the galaxy before the darkness could return. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Baba Yaga and Ilya stood together, watching the remnants of the empire burn. The war had ended, but the journey was just beginning. The fate of the galaxy lay in their hands now, and they would forge a future that no one could undo. The battle was over, but the true war had only just begun.